Hi, welcome to my channel, Reader Woman. My name's Judy, and let's talk what happened November, Nonfiction November. I wasn't planning on doing much, and but for my local book club, one of the books that we were reading happened to be nonfiction. It was called The Woo Woo by Lindsay Wong. She is a Canadian author based out of Vancouver, BC. And so we read this, and basically the small print says, How I Survived Ice Hockey, Drug Raids, Demons, and My Crazy Chinese Family. So it's a story of an immigrant family from China living in the Pacific Northwest, not necessarily in Vancouver, but just being, part of the area. It's well known ever since Hong Kong was taken over by the Chinese government that a lot of the people from Hong Kong came over, and because it was all part of the British protectorate, a lot of Chinese ended up showing up in Vancouver in particular. Quite a culture shift. Also, a lot of real estate changes. So it's become very expensive to live in Vancouver. You're going to spend $2.5 million for a small, not so nice family home. Yeah. And so for our neck of the woods, it's quite expensive. Ms. Wong talks about the mental illness that genetically was running through her family. Her grandmother had at least schizophrenia, if not more mental illnesses. And basically, some of it was passed down. It just was. And her mother, grandmother's daughter, was also very, very ill at times. In her young childhood, they would, her mother was so out of it that she just would, that is Sawyer, who is letting me know he thinks I should play with him. So it was really, really tough growing up in her household. Her mother with 3 small children, her idea of how to get out of the woo-woo, which is what she called the demons, ghosts, bad spirits, that they would go to the mall day in and day out. They would just hang out at the mall and then go shopping, eat there, sleep in the car, and then go back in the next day. She refused to go home for weeks, if not months. I don't remember how long a time it was, but it was a significant time. She wasn't taking care of the children. The author made the point that she really didn't know how to sorry, Sawyer may have to go outside or out of the office. Basically, they didn't know how to take care of themselves, cleanliness, brushing teeth, anything like that. And things got better somewhat as they got older, but their mom disappeared for a while, and then she showed up again. The father was very, the hockey. We're talking Canada, so of course it's ice hockey, and Canadians love ice hockey. That's what they live for. It's their national sport. And so her dad would pay her money for winning or for taking out an opponent and pushing him down on the ice. She'd get extra money. And, you know, I think he was trying to teach her how to stand up for herself, how to, you know, be strong and all the rest of it. But at the same token, it, you know, it's not something an 11-year-old or how an 11-year-old needs to be taught. So, so anyways, it was a troubled childhood, to say the least. It was humorous. They lived in a McMansion, but she always felt growing up that they were poor, but they weren't. They weren't, you know, the top 1%ers, but they were very, very comfortable. They had a trailer to go on vacations, which they would take vacations to Walmart parking lots. Although they did have a vacation at like Osoyos, and which is kind of inward across the forest from the Cascade Ridge. So drier side of the land. And yeah, I was enjoying it kind of, but then when on this vacation, when her mother has an episode and takes a blowtorch to Lindsay's feet in the trailer and burns them. At that point, it just didn't become fun. It became child abuse. And so you have a society who basically doesn't want to accept Western medicine, and who also see mental illness as a sign of ghosts and demons that are possessing people, rather than a brain chemistry that's not working properly. And there was one point where the mother was having to take care of her schizophrenic, mentally ill mother, who had finally gotten some help, some Western help, and who was on psychotropic drugs to try and calm her illness down and even her out. And so Lindsay's mother ends up taking the pills and hiding them and giving her, I don't know, sugar pills or whatever it was that she did in place of them. And her mother had another psychotic episode because of it. Lindsay herself ends up with a terrible, debilitating disease that affects the vision to the point where she's not able to see at times, and all she can do is, you know, sit down and hope that her, because I guess everything just kind of spins around and around and around. And yes, I have this on a chair. So anyways, it was an interesting story. It was cute when she was calling Vancouver Hongcouver, because basically, you know, the division of nationalities anymore in that big city is definitely predominantly Asian now. And, you know, there were some funny things, but it ultimately was sad. And you felt as though she just hadn't been cared for well enough as a child. And to me also, one last point on this. She talked about how it took education, going to college, going to grad school, for her to figure out how to be human. Because she was raised to be this, you know, me first, and I've got to take care of myself. I really don't care about, you know, or she didn't have a relationship with her siblings and, you know, stuff like that. So, yeah, it was really hard. And I thought to myself, that story would be appropriate with this. I mean, how did you get out of this, you know, somewhat, you know, I mean, she wasn't a sociopath, but, you know, a bit of tendencies simply because of how she was raised. It would have been nice to have seen how she learned empathy and sympathy for others other than herself. So, so yeah, the book was okay. It was okay. And then we come to the read of the month. And I'm sorry that my Kindle doesn't have the right cover, but it's Timothy Egan's The Worst Hard Time, about the untold story of those who survived the Great American Dust Storm. So for me, I've been enjoying reading Timothy Egan, so I thought this was another free Kindle library loan that I had borrowed from Amazon. So I just thought I would read that, little realizing what an impact it was going to have on me. Excuse me, it's all here. Come on. It talked about the area. I mean, my mother was born in Comanche, Oklahoma. Granted, it wasn't part of the Central Dust Bowl, but it wasn't that far out geographically from that. And it was still part of the drought dust area. And, you know, which from Canada on down to Texas affected this horrible, you know, this area so horribly. Now, my mother and her older sister, my aunt. Okay, I've got to get him out of here. He's driving me crazy. Sorry. Okay. Timothy Egan, The Worst Hard Time. It was in the area that my mother was born, where a portion of my ancestors are buried in Duncan, Oklahoma. And it's also a story that I don't really know, because I don't have the actual dates or anything, but my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, the family story is she found out that her husband, Grandpa Ben, was stepping out with a lady at the bar. And when she found out that was what was going on, she took her 2 daughters and got a guy with his son, and the 5 of them ran off in the middle of the night and were never heard of again until they were found, I don't know, 7 or 8 years later. So thinking about it, it must have been like from 1929 to 1931, somewhere in there. They were in California for the Great Depression. I know that. But they were in no way in Oklahoma trying to farm at that point when the Dust Bowl hit. So, you know, my grandmother was probably there for the big plow up that happened, and I think it was like 1930 or so, where everybody was plowing their fields because they needed the money, and wheat had been king for so many years. So So the book had this resonance in me, and it really kind of made me think about my family members because, you know, the people stayed. They were American farmers who loved the high plains, loved their land. I mean, of course, they were giving their lifeblood to it. This land that had, you know, for a couple of 3 years, given them huge amounts of money for farming. And, you know, and they were Americans. It's an American thing. We think that the best is going to happen, that things are going to get better. Sooner or later, things are going to get better. And Egan really did a good job of explaining that. The horror, I have to say, you know, 1934, it was such a big dust cloud that it went over Chicago and dumped tons and tons and tons of topsoil. And it went all the way to New York City, where it darkened the sky. And then ended up blowing out into the Atlantic before finally ending this erosion of the topsoil of all of these states. And then you had Black Sunday, April 14th, 1935, where this black, I don't know, they call it a cloud, but it was like 200 miles wide, and so tall. I forget how tall it was, but they were saying instead of it rotating like this, it was rotating like this. And basically, it took a beautiful Sunday with the sky shining, blue skies, everything perfect, to darkness and this huge dust storm that just enveloped everyone, and that felt like the end of the world. Children, the elderly, dying of dust pneumonia because, you know, so much of it was being ingested. The farm animals, that if they weren't starving to death, were being suffocated by all the dust in their stomachs. You know, they weren't living plush lives as it was, and to actually have to, you know, read about how hard it was to survive, and then basically the banks were foreclosing left and right. And yeah, it's a great book. It's an American tragedy, the biggest environmental disaster in American history. And I think it's so important today as it was to read about it. It was published, I believe it was, let's see if I can find it quickly, 2006. So it's a few years old, but yeah, well worth picking up. I was enthralled from the beginning to the end, and I haven't been able to stop talking about it, so I thought I'd come on here and talk about it a little bit. But yeah, a total recommendation for that, and I'm so glad that I at least read a couple of books that were nonfiction for November. So if you read anything, I would love to hear what you were reading. I will be back soon, and happy reading. Bye.